Hello and welcome. Those of you who have watched my channel for some time will know that I absolutely love unusual musical instruments. And recently I acquired a new cornet that is definitely the most unusual cornet in my collection and goes well on the way to being one of the most unusual instruments in my collection. And this is it here. This is the Buescher Epoch. This is a 1906 model cornet, and it comes to me from the United States of America land. Now this is possibly one of the most expensive cornets that I have bought, but I absolutely wanted it for my collection. But let's give a little bit of a brief history about this instrument and the maker of this instrument before we dive into the unusual elements of it. So Buescher was a fellow who lived in America once upon a time, and he started off working in the late 1800s for another American company called Con. And around 1984 he decided to leave them and start up his own instrument company. So he made a series of instruments. He started a company that was called Buescher and then changed its name to Buescher Band Instrument Company, and they made a whole lot of band instruments up until the point where he sold it off and still remained in charge, and then later died, as what happens to most people. And in 1960s I believe it was acquired by Selma. So there's the world's most accurate and most detailed historical account of the man in the company. But the important thing as far as I'm concerned is the fact that he worked for Con, he left Con, started up his own instrument company. And that's is kind of interesting to me because there are some clear Con influences in this cornet. Let's take a look at the instrument. The first thing that you'll notice if you start from this end where your face connects to it, this is a modern mouthpiece. This is my Dennis Wick 5B, which is my cornet mouthpiece of preference. We have a fairly standard lead pipe right up until we get to this point. It is a reversed lead pipe, which means that the tuning sleeve goes over the mouthpiece receiver. On standard instruments, we have the tuning slide goes inside the mouthpiece receiver, as we see in the bottom part of it. So if we extend this and pull it back in, you'll see that at the bottom part, the tuning slide goes inside this tube, whereas in the top part, the tuning slide goes over the top of the lead pipe. That's what we call a reversed lead pipe. The idea behind that is it reduces turbulence because the ridge at the end of the lead, the end of the tuning slide is not on the inside, interrupting the airflow. This reversed lead pipe configuration is exactly the same to a Con cornet I have, which was made at about the same time, which is this, my Conqueror. The next odd thing, and something that I haven't seen on any other cornet or other instrument before, is that it has a little reservoir for your water key. So this is your water key here, and then we have this little trough that is attached to the bottom of the main tuning slide. And so the idea with this is that as condensation from the moisture of your breath and spit and fluids and whatever else you tried to chuck through this instrument, as that accumulates inside the tubing, instead of it interfering with the airflow, it instead goes down into this little trough where it can be collected nicely until emptied by the standard actuation of your water key. That's not something I've ever seen on an instrument before. And is kind of a novel, although rather ugly, appendage to the instrument. But the biggest thing about this instrument is the peculiarities with the valves. Even the not very observant among you will have noticed that the first two valves are quite long. The third valve, however, is quite short. Now, Buescher had a myriad of arrangements of the lengths of their valves. The original Buescher Epoch had a short first valve, a short third valve, and the second valve was the same length, but it just sat down lower. So you'd have valve 1 that went like this, valve 2 that was down there, and valve 3 that was back up at the normal height. This is, I think, their third version of the Epoch valve system, where we have the two long valves and then the one short valve. There are versions of this that have a short first valve, but it's still slightly longer than the third valve. And then later on, they made all three valves the same length aesthetically, but the inner valve was just different components and things like that. And the reason why they've done all of this is a different implementation of the air flow through the conqueror. It's the same sort of approach, the same sort of intent, but just a different execution. And so in both instruments, they are trying to get the smoothest possible airflow through the instrument. In the case of the Buescher Epoch, the airflow goes through the lead pipe into the first valve. Then it goes through the first valve tuning slide, which is up in here, if you've pressed the first valve. If you haven't pressed the first valve, then it obviously bypasses this tubing. We then have a loop on the back which connects the first and the third valves together. And then you've got your third valve tuning slide, which is this long bulbous appendage out the side here. And then we've got this ancillary tuning slide, which serves to bridge the third valve with the second valve, but in a non-direct way. We've then got this tiny little second valve that sits at the bottom there, and then the air goes out the instrument via this tube through to the bell section. If we take another look just at the conqueror, the pathways through the valves are a little bit similar, but the whole design of the valves is the same sort of concept. It's just slightly different. We've got the tubing that links the first and third valve together. We've got a very indirect linkage between the third valve and the second valve, which is it serves as a secondary tuning slide. So it's very similar in concept, just obviously the execution is different enough that both can have their own patent. The design intent with this is to have an instrument where the ports through the valves, the little holes that snake through the valves, are as least dramatic as possible, because any sort of dramatic bend or kink or twist in the tube introduces resistance, and so they wanted to avoid that. And so if you look at the bottom of this instrument, you have quite an aesthetically pleasing configuration. Everything sort of sweeps into the valve quite nicely, and the architect and the patent drawing that goes behind this design is also similarly aesthetic. It looks quite nice compared to the standards that we have today. Taking a look at the valves themselves are quite strange looking. We see ports that are very close to being straight through. The ports through the valves, even the lower bottom one, are still very free flowing, relatively speaking. And you'll also notice that the entry holes of those ports are close together, more close together than what you would see on traditional cornets of this age. All three valves of this instrument are different lengths. If you have a look at the valve casing, then the bottommost port on the first valve is there. All of the space here is completely unused, which is why on some of the first designs, the first valve was also short, because it doesn't need to be another hole through this. There doesn't need to be any reason for that extra length. On the second valve, the bottommost port is down here, so that valve needs to be longer, and then the third valve, the bottommost port is up here. So that's why we've got three different length valves. And if we look at the valves themselves, we can see this is 1 and 2, so the second valve is a lot longer. And then if I get 2 and 3, this is where a third hand would be quite useful. You can see the quite obvious difference in the length of the second and third valves when you compare the two. So as a result of all of that, you're never going to get your valves mixed up, which is kind of cool. It's an inadvertent benefit to this particular system. The biggest problem with this particular example of the Buescher Epoch, though, is that the second valve unfortunately leaks. The tolerance of the valve and the way that it's been worn down over these past 115 years means that the valve wobbles quite a lot inside the valve casing, and as a consequence of that slop, there's a lot of air leaks. So trying to play this instrument is not actually something you're going to get a satisfactory tone out of. So unfortunately, as gorgeous and as interesting as this instrument is, it's just going to end up ultimately on my wall of many things, because it's something that, unless I was to go to the extent and the expense of replating the valves and getting them rehoned to the correct proportions and fitting properly, it's not really going to be playable. I'll try to play it, but that's the results that you're going to get are going to be unsatisfactory.